This week on the Writers Detective Bureau, female suspects, writing research, and police cars. I'm Adam Richardson, and this is the Writers Detective Bureau. Welcome to episode 46 of the Writers Detective Bureau, the podcast dedicated to helping authors and screenwriters write professional quality, crime-related fiction. I'd like to thank Gold Shield patron Deborah Dunbar from DeborahDunbar.com, Gold Shield patron CC Jameson from CCJameson.com, and my two newest Gold Shield patrons Larry Keaton and Vicky Tharp of VickyTharp.com for their support. I'd also like to thank my newest Coffee Club patrons Chris Schuler, Kelly Garrett, and Brandon Jones, as well as all of my longtime Coffee Club patrons for their support month after month. Check out the website links for all of the writers supporting this show in the show notes at writersdetective.com/46. And to learn about setting up your own Patreon account for your author business, visit writersdetective.com/Patreon. Patreon. This week's first question comes from Bill Group. You can find Bill's work at wjgroupjr.com, and the links for that will be in the show notes, which you can find at writersdetective.com/46. And Bill asks, does a female suspect always need to be accompanied by a female officer? Good question, Bill. I wish we had enough women in law enforcement for that to be practical. So the answer is no. But we are definitely mindful of this situation, and we have specific protocols for handling it. For instance, when I arrest a female suspect, it is definitely preferred that a female officer searches the suspect, but that often isn't an option. So in that case, I was taught to do the post-arrest pat-down search, where I'm looking for weapons, using the back of my hand, and to do so with another officer present, because we still need to do our jobs and not risk our safety. And not searching a female just because a female officer isn't on duty is not safe. Nowadays, with more officers wearing body cameras, it's a lot easier to defend against false allegations, especially when it comes to some sort of alleged wrongdoing between a male officer and a female suspect. Even when we are transporting a female to the station or to jail, we advise dispatch that we are transporting a female, and we log the start and ending mileage as well as the time of when we departed and when we arrived. And now with our in-car cameras, we can record the suspect in the back seat of our car as well. And then once they're in the station for an interview or an interrogation, all of that is video and audio recorded as well. So until we have an equal number of women to men working in law enforcement, it really isn't feasible for female suspects to always be accompanied by female officers. Thanks for the question, Bill. Again, you can find Bill's work at wjgroupjr.com, and you can find his link at writersdetective.com/46 in the show notes. My latest Coffee Club patron on Patreon is Brandon Jones, and he sent in a few questions for us this week. So let's get started with Brandon's first question. I want to thank you for the fantastic podcast and in-depth answers. I've made pages of notes outlining my novel and even made my own murder board like on Castle. I've done interviews for my novel. How in-depth should a novelist's notes be before they actually start writing? Thanks again, Brandon. Well, thank you for the kind words, Brandon. I appreciate it. So, in the plotter versus pantser, or discovery writer, as Joanna Penn prefers to be called, in the plotter versus discovery writer debate, you are clearly a plotter, Brandon, and that is awesome. But regardless of which side of the writing fence you're on, the answer to the best time to start writing is years ago. And of course, the second best time to start writing is now. Creating the murder board and doing interviews are awesome for crafting a very compelling story. So that is definitely going to pay off. But you have to remember, writing is a craft. Writing is a skill. Writing takes work. Writing means you write regularly, if not every day. And the only way of honing your skill, of honing your craft, is putting it to the grindstone. So you need to start writing now. Every single writer, myself included, is guilty of not writing when they know they should be writing. That's why those memes exist of you should be writing now. I mean, how much more research do you really need to do before you can start writing? Now, I'm not knocking research. I mean, that's what this podcast, the Facebook group, the website, my upcoming book, they're all about that. But many of us will get stuck in research mode as a way of self-sabotage, as a means of feeling good about really just procrastinating. And we never really accomplish anything. Why? Probably because we're afraid of failing. All of those what ifs, like, what if my story sucks? What if I don't sell many books? What if I don't sell any books? What if I get 1-star reviews? What if? Even if you aren't consciously thinking those things, like you don't have this negative self-talk, which is awesome if that's the case, but you really need to stop and look at your actions. What are your actions telling you about those goals you have? Like writing an amazing story. What are your actions telling you about how you really feel about those goals? All it takes to become a writer is to write. That's all it takes. Sounds simple, right? But sometimes that's the scariest and the toughest part of all of it. So we busy ourselves instead with all the things, to fool ourselves and others into believing it, rather than just doing it. I mean, Nike figured it out, right? I've used this analogy before. Writing is just like running. Are you a runner? All you have to do is run to be a runner. Just do it. So, are you a writer? All you have to do is write. Just do it. And this week's next couple questions also came from Brandon Jones, but he submitted it last week and I didn't get the chance to answer it yet. So here it goes. Brandon asked, do detectives still use the Crown Victorias, and can a detective use their personal vehicle, or do departments have their own policies? Secondly, would it be ethical to base your novel off of an unsolved case from 2012? Thank you for your years of service and time. Thanks, Brandon. For those of you living outside of the United States, the Crown Victoria that Brandon is referencing is the big sedan that Ford started making in the early 1990s. The Crown Victoria was the successor to Ford's LTD line of sedans. It's a big four-door car with a large trunk and a 4.6-liter V8 engine, and it was well suited for police work. And once police departments started turning these Crown Vics, as we call them, into police cars, Ford started offering a police version of the Crown Vic called the Police Interceptor. The Police Interceptor version of the Crown Vic included improved vehicle handling components like the shocks, the springs, and sway bars. And then the later models, once more agencies started putting in more electronics into the patrol cars, like the computers and the camera systems, Ford started including higher amperage batteries and alternators to power all of that stuff. If you've seen any cop shows or movies set in the United States in the last 20 years, you have undoubtedly seen the Ford Crown Victoria. But the Crown Vic is most often used as a patrol car. There are many agencies that used the Crown Vic as a detective car as well. In fact, in the Amazon show Bosch drives an all-black Crown Vic as his assigned detective unit. And in fact, I had one as well at one point. And the LAPD actually refers to their own, in their own LAPD specific lingo, their detective cars that are plain, not marked like a black and white or a uniformed patrol car. They will call that a plain wrap. Now, only LAPD uses the term plain wrap that I'm aware of. But if you're writing about the LAPD, you might find that useful. But anyway, Most agencies actually assign cars other than the Crown Victoria as detective cars. So the Ford Taurus and the Dodge Stratus were popular detective cars when I was in our, what I call the suit and tie detective units. This was mainly because the Crown Victoria was more expensive. And I say was because Ford discontinued the Crown Vic in 2011. So I guess it was actually model year 2012. Now, that said, there's still many of them on the street nearly a decade later. And many agencies actually stocked up on the Crown Vic fleet when it was announced that Ford was going to stop making them. So for several years after Ford ceased production, there was still a decent inventory of 0-mile Crown Vics waiting to be put into service in police fleets all across the country. And a lot of the reason for this is because they would take the police equipment like the divider and the light bar and all of those things that were designed for the Crown Vic. It was cheaper to just reuse those pieces of equipment. So rather than having to get all new radio, panels and the dividers for the front seat to back seat for a different model of vehicle, it was just easier and cheaper to buy all the remaining Crown Vics and wait to put those into service. Now, it's important to understand that the reason why these Crown Vics were so loved is how sturdy and beefy and well-designed they were. I mean, they had their problems, but it takes a special kind of car to be able to go well over 100 miles an hour and stand up to being run pretty much 24/7. Patrol day shift arrives at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, and then they drive that car all day long. Then they hand it over to patrol night shift, who drive it all night long. And then it's back out on day shift again the next morning for years. I mean, these cars might get an hour of being turned off, especially now that we have the computers in the cars where it needs to have power and you don't want to shut off your car. So we've got these systems with the big alternator and the systems to kick your car back on after it's been sitting for a few minutes. So these cars really do run 24/7. And let's face it, cops drive like, let's call them maniacs. All right, cops drive like maniacs, or at least they're chasing maniacs. So these cars are always on, they're always hot, and they're always driven like a bat out of hell. Now, to spend the money on a car that can do that, you don't need to do that for detectives, because detective cars, or for the most part, aren't driven that way. So the cheaper sedans are just fine for detective work. And before I go any further, I should mention that Ford created 2 new Police Interceptor vehicles to replace the Crown Vic Police Interceptor. Ford created a Police Interceptor based on the Ford Taurus sedan, which is not all that well received because it's a front-wheel drive car, and cops prefer to have rear-wheel drive cars for the handling and performance reasons. But then they also created the Ford Explorer SUV Police Interceptor, and the SUV has clearly been the most popular replacement. And some agencies in the U.S. have shifted to the Dodge Charger sedan or the Chevy Caprice or the Chevy Impala. But having driven the Ford Explorer Police Interceptor SUV, I can tell you that it is an amazing vehicle when it comes to speed and handling, and they even make one that has a turbo. But it's like driving on rails. It's unbelievable. Anyway, to get back to Brandon's question about detectives driving their own cars, that is a good question. And I'd say that well over 95% of the police agencies in the U.S. provide cars to their detectives. Now, some agencies in Hawaii used to give their officers light bars to put on their own vehicles for work, but I don't know if that is still the case. And the same with some smaller agencies in the Midwest, but by and large, you do not drive your personal vehicle for work for 2 primary reasons. Number 1, liability. In California, if I get into a wreck in an emergency vehicle, which is a department-owned vehicle equipped with a red light and a siren, then that accident does not affect my personal driving record, especially with respect to it affecting my personal car insurance. So if I'm working but get into an accident in my personal vehicle, my personal car insurance is on the hook, and then if I'm at fault, it's also going on my driving record, not to mention any lawsuits that stem out of it. The second reason is my family. whether it's an interview of a witness or doing surveillance of a suspect, or heaven forbid, I have to put a suspect in my personal car because I've arrested them. I don't want anyone seeing the car and license plates of the vehicle I drive with my family in on the weekends. There are many agencies, especially in the Midwest of the U.S., where officers have personalized law enforcement license plates and blue lights on their personal vehicles, essentially advertising that they're cops. Which, I mean, if you live in a safe community like that, that's great, but it just seems completely foreign to me. We are targets enough when we're on duty, and the last thing I want is to be ambushed while I'm out with my family because someone was looking to kill a cop or targeting me specifically, and I just made it easy for them to find me. Brandon's next question was whether it was ethical to base your novel on an unsolved case from 2012. I think that it's really a question you need to answer for yourself. And a lot of that will come from how you plan to write and market the story. The late Sue Grafton based Q is for Quarry on an open, unsolved murder case, but she did so with the intention of using her platform to help bring an old, unsolved case from the 1980s back to the public spotlight with the hopes of helping solve the case. I personally think it is a matter of your intention. If you're using the notoriety of an unsolved case to try to win some free marketing out of it or profiting off of it because you know this will catch headlines, then no. I think you're then using the case as a means to an end that I don't think many people would find very moral. But if your intention going into it and the way that you market it is to help bring a murderer to justice, and you think that retelling of the story will help solve the case, then I do think you can be ethical in telling the story. I personally am a big fan of Kantian ethics. Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, said that essentially rather than measuring ethics by the outcome like utilitarianism, you need to ask yourself if the action itself, in this case, telling the story of an unsolved case, has a moral worth. And then applying Kant's categorical imperative, whether that action would be considered universally moral or not, giving particular thought to not using any people simply as a means to your desired end. You should ask yourself, would it be moral if anyone else did it, if they did this to me? Which is quite similar to the golden rule. So I think the answer to the question of whether telling this story is moral or not is yours to answer. Thank you so much for listening this week. Make sure you hit that subscribe button to get every episode of the Writers Detective Bureau podcast auto-magically. If you enjoyed this episode, would you leave me a review? And if you didn't, share this podcast with someone who will. This podcast is created for you, so don't be shy. Send me your crime fiction questions by going to writersdetective.com/podcast. Thanks again for listening. Have a great week and write well.